Chapter 6. Alexander and Macedonia. Oh, the grand old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill. And he marched them down again. Traditional. Of the period of Alexander unhappily little survives in the way of authenticated ancient history relating to his remarkable career. It is an extraordinary fact that for over 300 years, until Arrian and Curtius wrote works purporting to describe his expeditions, nothing apparently was written of him. Both these men, highly distinguished, lived from about the middle of the 1st century AD to its end, and although the 7 books of Arrian remain fairly intact, of Curtius 10 books the first 2 are lost, and the remainder reveal considerable gaps or deletions of events, suggesting the work of a censor at a later date, as in very many other cases. Curtius must be suspected of having described movements or events which embarrassed later authorities. Arrian, for his part, wrote in a colloquial style, imitating Xenophon, with the difference that Xenophon knew Cyrus personally, whereas Arrian was dependent on such records or extracts as he could collect and whose accuracy we cannot check. One might have supposed that Josephus, who covers a wide field, would have had something more to say of Alexander, who, previous to going to Babylon, had visited Jerusalem, where the high priest and elders met him in tremulation outside the city, when to their surprise and relief he venerated the high priest's mitre with the name of the deity inscribed in gold. 133 Yet Josephus dismissed his going to Babylon in a few words. All this is significant when we consider that Alexander overthrew the long-held Persian domination of the ancient world, and went as 133 Josephus, Antiquities, 11, 5, 1. Far east as is India, and as far south as to build the city of Alexandria. It constitutes a mystery that so famous a figure who, like his father Philip too, was a great patron of learning, was educated by Aristotle and surrounded himself with scholars, was yet apparently ignored and almost forgotten for over 3 centuries. The explanation may be that his movements and conquests were too revealing for those whose object it was to prevent any geographical or historical description which might throw another light on the past and prejudice the aims they had in view. Alexander's first great battle was by the river Granicus in Phrygia, Hanover, and from there he pursued Darius Codomanus into Asiatic Cilicia, where he gained another overwhelming victory over the Persian, who fled, leaving his mother, wife, and children at Alexander's mercy. Some 2 years later, for the 3rd time, they met in the plains of Gaugamela in Assyria, Saxony, and again the Persian king fled. Alexander then visited Babylon, but not for long, as he set out again, this time into Media, Hungary, in pursuit of Darius, whom he followed into Parthia. The Partheni and Alani were Massagetae dwelling in the present Finland and North Russia, but once more Darius escaped him. After this, Alexander proceeded over the mountains, Urals, then reached Bactria, Turkestan, and finally crossed the Hindu Kush, whence he descended to the Indus. In India he easily conquered and civilized the natives, who called the invaders the noble Khattiyo area, whence developed the Brahmin caste, from intercourse with the Macedonian soldiery. 134. His return march is uncertain, but he ultimately reached Ecbatana or Ecbatana, capital of Media, after 6 years' absence, and from there returned to Babylon. He had proclaimed Babylon the capital of the Macedonian Empire, and had been there for some months when he died of pneumonia after an illness of 11 days, caused by a chill contracted when bathing. On his first visit he was received with the greatest demonstrations of enthusiasm by the populace, who thronged. 134 Geoffrey Higgins, Anacalypsis, 2, p. 130. The archaeologist describes a crucifix, a ring, a lamb, and an elephant, carved upon the fire tower of Brechin, Forfar, at an ancient date. The ring, emblem of eternity, and its cobra, sacred serpent, linga, phallus, ioni or yoni, feminine organ were all Hindu. The Gainsa of India is a very stubborn fellow to be found here. The walls, the streets, and the outside of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, or castle. They strewed flowers, burnt frankincense, and loudly acclaimed him. The Chaldean and Babylonian magi met him, singing hymns of praise, and led him to the palace. Was he not of Chaldean birth himself as a Macedonian? Were not his religious beliefs those of the Babylonians, despite his tolerance? It was natural and proper that they should honor a prince of their own blood who had completely overthrown the tyrannical Persian kings. Alexander decided to rebuild Babylon. He was disgusted with the ruined state in which he found it, with walls broken down, the accumulated rubbish from the immense temple of Bel lying yet, and an enormous breach in the river, which needed to be restored to its former channel. He issued orders for 10,000 men to clear the rubbish from the temple of Bel, and another 10,000 to restore the river to its former channel. How much of this was completed is not known. On his return from India, the Chaldean priests met Alexander outside the gates and ordered him not to enter the city except by the east gate, probably owing to some astrological prediction. All we know from the vestige of its history at this time is that it had a harbour with ships, and shipbuilding in the yards, very unaccountable as relating to the alleged Babylon in Iraq. One curious piece of information has come down to us, giving the names of various embassies sent to Alexander when at Babylon to invoke his favour. They were European Scythians, Scots from the Perth area, Celtic and Iberian tribes, Cimmerians, Ethiopia, Mull, Carthage, Waterford region of southern Ireland, Libya, Leinster, Ireland, Bruttii, Alba or Albania, Stirling and southwest Scotland, Lucania, branch of Bruttii, Tyrrhene, Lancashire, Delphi, Ben Cruachan, Argyll, Ely's, Lismore Island, mouth of Loch Linhey, Corinth, Crenan, head of Cantyre, Argyll and Epidaurus, South Argyll. These are not conjectural sites, but all related to Britain. Not one hailed from the East. 135. 135 Historians History of the World, London Times, XXXIV, p. 387. And when we come to consider the original situation of Macedonia, is it not what we should expect? What interest would the Celtic and Iberian tribes in the north of Europe have had in a king proposing to make his capital at the other end of the world? Or, the Bruttii? Or, in fact, any of them? The explanation comes from the original situation of Macedonia itself. These mainly North British tribes or clans, apart from those in Erin, were naturally anxious to know how their frontiers might be affected by this intended great shift of the capital of Macedonia. They also naturally desired to enter into treaties with the victorious king who was transferring his ruling city from Chaldea or Caledon to the Chaldea in the very south of Yorkshire, over 350 miles distant. Also, we should not overlook their anxiety in regard to the king's character. His father Philip, who had paved the way for his son's crushing victories by his unconquerable army, small in numbers but perfectly trained and equipped, was, for all his military genius, a cruel tyrant, and kept all the Greek states in vassalage or fear. Was there a risk of Alexander doing the same? He was generous, impulsive, but disposed to intoxication and murderous passions, during which he had killed several of his nearest friends. The Book of Maccabees throws a light on how he was regarded later. The land was silenced before him, and he was exalted and his heart was lifted up, and he gathered together a very mighty army and ruled over lands and principalities, and they became tributary unto him. I Maccabees 1, 3-4. Exalted, the editors of the Cambridge Maccabees analyzed that word. Had he a psychological problem? Was he a mad genius? Alexander seems to have become intoxicated by his success. He appears to have even had a fatuous notion that he was divine. At all events, he encouraged the spread of a report that Jupiter Ammon had called him his son, and granted him the distinction of being the conqueror of the world. In accordance with this truly exalted conception of himself, he exacted divine honors, not only from the Persians, but from the Macedonians as well, and even ordered the philosopher Callisthenes to be put to death for refusing to prostrate himself before him. The character of Alexander the Great presents something of the nature of a psychological puzzle. There was evidently a process of degeneration which became more rapid as the years went on. 136. Alexander had coins minted showing his features relating to the god Hermes or Ammon, the most vital deity of the Britons, or Macedonians for this particular argument, superior in some respects even to Apollo, as Homer recognized, because he was the living deity, in the person of the archdruid, or arch-hierarch, who spoke as the vox dei to the entire Celtic world. If Nebuchadnezzar, as head of the Chaldeans, had been so ordained, it seems extremely probable that Alexander was accorded such divinity in his turn, for regal claims to divinity were not uncommon. He would in such circumstances be justified in expecting Callisthenes to prostrate himself as did others. Alexander, who had utterly destroyed the Asiatic Persian tyranny, which had enslaved the West for so long, deserved deification if any monarch did from his own people the Chaldeans. The Macedonians. Kinquirim of Nineveh from distant Ophir. Dirty British coaster with a salt-caked smokestack, 137. There are other outstanding facts relating to the Macedonians that are of considerable importance, for they clearly reveal that they were of Caledonian origin. It is known to the all Bible students that the name of Hate related to the Macedonians, and, as Waddell states, was corrupted into Hittites, later Chittim and possibly Shittim, which variation may refer to Shet, Sheth, or Seth, otherwise Shetland, as their place of. 136 Reverend W. Fairweather and J. Dutherland Black, Cambridge Maccabees, 1908, p. 55. The learned editors do not seem to be aware that Philip II also was hailed as a god and had a statue of himself executed as such. 137 Cargoes, John Masefield. Origin. 138 There is no doubt as to their importance in the evolution of civilization. Hate, or Cheth 139 was accounted the second son of Canaan in one passage, but as Hittim or Chittim are called the sons of Javan, son of Japheth, earliest of all patriarchs in Genesis, 10, 2-4. When Abram seized the land of Canaan and built Hebron, apparently sons of Hate had preceded him. He was buried beside Sarah his wife in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, a Hittite, which Abram purchased of the sons of Hate. 25, 9-10, Abram rode roughshod over the Philistines or Miazramites in those parts, took their cities and extracted tribute from them, but compensated the sons of Hate for the field of Ephron. The Hittites or Chittim were the most active and important nation in the southwest, especially from a maritime point of view. Ships, of Shittim, shall afflict Ashur, prophesied Balaam, Numbers 24, 24. They had a great deal to do with the metal trade also. Cyprus was an important naval base of theirs to enable ships of Chittim to intervene when needed along the lines of sea communication. Cyprus produced copper, but eventually the original Cyprus was destroyed in a huge earthquake and became derelict. It was then called Ophiosa Island, Isle of Serpents, meaning earthquake, volcanic eruption, lightning, etc. I have identified this island as one of the Isles of Chittim, surviving yet as Lundy, 16 miles off the west coast of Cornwall, today a mass of meteoric debris. It is perhaps interesting to record that when Alexander the Great was besieging Tyre, he prevented the Tyrians from sending their women and children by sea to Carthage. This was no Mediterranean maneuver. Tyre is represented today by Portland and Melcombe Regis, Dorset, both extremely ancient. The Tyrians wanted to send their women and children to distant County Waterford in southern Ireland, the original Carthage, but the Chittim or Macedonians. 138 Waddell. 139 cf. Macbeth. From their rocky island Ophiosa, intercepted any ships which dared to pass that way. Ophiosa or Lundy commanded the approaches both from the English and the Bristol Channel. The name Chittim came to be used as a synonym for the lands of the West, but it referred to the Macedonians. Their true appellation, as Waddell is at great pains to specify, was Cassi, Catti, or Catti. Hence the Isles of Chittim were also called Cassiderides, Isles of the Cassi. He throws another curious sidelight on their activities by claiming, with his long study of Indian antiquities, that the Brahmins of India believe in their descent from the original white men, the Aryan caste, Kattiya Arya, who colonized their country for a while. They were Ari or Arya in ancient Pali, the noble ones. 140 They were the Macedonians, led thither by Alexander. We retrieve the name Kati or Kati in Caithness and in the Don Valley and elsewhere, whence came the original Chaldeans or Caledonians. The lion race, the Kati, or Cats, included the Thracians and / or the Macedonians. The famous latter people were descended from the Edeneans, whose territories originally embraced eastern Scotland from the Moray Firth to the mouth of the Tay, hence the name Mac, son of, the Edens. Their religious head was the Gad, or god, Hermes, chief hierarch or archdruid, whose city was Ur of the Chaldees, or Samothrace, in southern Orkney. This people sent colonies to southern England, and to Gades or Sodom, Avonmouth, Somerset, called Hittite or Chittim, even before Abram and Lot reached those same parts. If any existing people can claim to be Atlanteans, it is these Caledonians. The ancient clan Chattan still flourishes. Among its chiefs is the Macintosh of Macintosh, whose estates stretch from Petty to Loch Haber, and who claims descent from Hate, son of Canaan. Such is recorded in the Iona Club transactions, which contain the pedigrees of the most ancient Scottish clans. Long ago the Macintosh dwelt at Tor Castle, at Inverlochie, today a crumbling ruin, yet famous as the 140 Waddell site where Banquo, whose ghost so troubled the usurper of Duncan's throne, was murdered by Macbeth. On the other hand, the Macphersons of Cluny claim to be the senior branch of Clan Chattan, and from the exhaustive evidence contained in a recent work, The Chiefs of Clan Macpherson, this seems to be indisputable. 141 In any case, whether the titular honour rests with the Macphersons of Cluny or the Macintosh, both are of the same noble blood as the Macedonians, who have dwelt in their motherland for possibly over 5,000 years. It is a staggering, but also elevating thought, of a clan that has played its part over so many great periods of the past, and Scotland can claim others of most ancient pedigree. The fact that the Macphersons and the Macintoshes of Clan Chattan are still dwelling in or about their ancient domains, and still a virile and commanding people, should give us understanding of the reality of the past in relation to the Macedonians, so wrongly relegated to a part of the Balkans. Tor Castle has lain in ruin for centuries, but ages before it was erected the sons of Hate, the Catti, ventured from the north to the regions of the Og of Bashan in Gloucestershire, and became widely known as Hittim or Chittim, as Gadites to the later Jews. They were worshippers of Apollo and ruled by their druids. They were men of stern discipline and brave soldiers against whom the Persians collapsed. If Alexander had not died so early and his greedy generals had not broken up the Macedonian Empire, the world's history subsequently would have been very different. This relocation of the Macedonians may give us the answer to the vexing problem of their early coinage. Authorities such as Sir John Evans, Hawkins, Ackerman, Post, and others have never been able to explain why a great many primitive British coins are Macedonian in idea and design and stigmatize them as base or degraded imitations of the stater of Philip of Macedon. 141 by Macpherson of Dalcolly, whose chief was Ewan George Macpherson of Cluny. In the pedigree appears Hate, also Mac Hate, and an Og, which touches very closely on early Bible history relating to Abram. Evans, puzzled to account for their apparent relationship, and as to the reasons which impelled the Britons to strike coins on a Macedonian model, argued that there was a diffusion of gold staters in the reign of Philip II owing to the discovery of gold at Crenides in the Pangaeum Mountains of Macedonia, and that the barbarians of Britain imitated the Macedonian type. 142 In his reign gold was extensively mined in the Pangaeum Mountains and brought him in a revenue of over £200,000 per annum. Incidentally, no sign of any gold workings has been discovered in the mountains of Macedonia, nor does the stratum lend itself to such a likelihood. 143. Evans admitted that British Macedonian coins were not slavish imitations and showed innovations. No doubt of the derivation from the stater, he said. Possibly an original type, and probably the carefully dressed hair was one of the attributes of Apollo Belinus of Gaul and Britain, whose head it is supposed was represented. 144. There is little doubt that Apollo Belinus was used to decorate the coins of the Britons, whose kings took the name of the god as their title, as Cunobelin and Cassibelin, corrupted by the Romans into Belliunus. Nor is there any doubt that they were designs independent of Philip II, for their base or barbaric types, crude as they were, dated from a period long anterior to Philip, who unified the coinage, and designed it artistically upon the earlier models. Macedonian history, reconstructed as Caledonian in origin, explains the object of the designs with the striking astronomical symbols they represent. They may be compared with the ancient engraved stones such as the Goldsby stone. Both early British and Philippian coins make great play of the sign Pegasus, in accord with the Chaldean knowledge of astronomy. Studies of these coins reveal Pegasus as a sign of the zodiac, on the earliest models, occupying the sign later allotted to Aquarius. They 142 Sir John Evans, Coins of the Ancient Britons, p. 24. 143 Gold was mined long ago in the northern Scottish mountains near Kildonan. 144 Evans, pp 24-26. Coins not only exhibit the sun and moon but also twin cometary bodies identifiable by the spectacles designed to represent revolutionary movement from sign to sign. The intention was plainly a pious reminder from the Druid-led world that the deity Apollo, representing Sirius, also shown on the obverse side, destroyed the world by a celestial body or bodies which traditionally were first observed in the sign of Pegasus, a sign later changed to Aquarius with his urn to record for all ages that then occurred the great catastrophe, the flood that afflicted the ancient world, and especially Scotland. Macedonian coins of the Philippian age have been found at many places in the British Isles. A parcel of coins of Macedonian kings of Syria was discovered on the southwest coast of Ireland early in the 18th century. 145 Macedonian British gold coins were unearthed at Audley, Essex, which Evans said were similar, both obverse and reverse, to the stater of Philip. 146. At Uricunion, near Droitwich, once an important Romano-British city, coins described as a degraded imitation of the stater of Philip were unearthed with Roman coins of the Hadrian age and earlier, as in many similar instances. The most interesting was a find of coins of Philip, of Alexander, and of the Bruttii, on the estate of Cairnbolg, Aberdeenshire, in 1824.147. The Edeni territories were in the actual Macedonia itself, and this, in conjunction with the coins of the Bruttii, who dwelled in southwest Scotland, would suggest that the owner collected them from British sources in the reign of Alexander himself or not much later. 148. Before coined money was invented, gold, silver, and brass rings were the recognized medium of exchange. In Egypt are fresco. 145 John Lindsay, A View of the Coinage of Ireland, p. 2. 146 Evans, pp 47-8. 147 Roberts, p. 53. 148 Cassie coins sometimes show Capricorn as half goat, half fish, with the word eppi, epilus, eppicom. It is probably Errelis or Erri, relating to Errol in Perth, a conspicuous landmark in the Firth of Tay and once an important town, p being the Greek r, rho. Paintings on tombs showing people bringing tribute in bags containing gold and silver rings, and vases have been found depicting persons weighing gold and silver rings. Lindsay says of Ireland that great quantities of gold, silver, and brass rings have been dug up at various times. They were used as money, graduated according to troy weight, in multiples of 12, not 10. He records a find of brass rings that fully loaded a large cart, discovered in a tumulus in County Monaghan, indicating the antiquity of this medium for purchasing power in the British Isles. One other matter deserving of our attention in relation to the antiquity and origin of the Macedonians is their national emblem, the unicorn. Daniel described Macedonia symbolically as a he-goat with one horn. The first Macedonian king traditionally made the unicorn his ensign and designated his capital Egi or Goat's Town, and the son of Alexander the Great by Roxanne was named Son of the Goat, the beast being generally represented with one long straight horn, later in appearance like a horse with similar straight horn. Elian, in his Natural History, said the woolly rhinoceros existed in Britain in far prehistoric days like the mammoth or woolly elephant, its remains having been found under the drift deposit. To this day the unicorn rampant is one of the supporters of the royal coat of arms, facing the lion rampant, and prior to the Union, the royal arms of Scotland carried a unicorn rampant as supporter on each side. It wants some explaining away. Altogether, therefore, in origin, history, and activities, supported as they are in nomenclature, in classic history, in geography, in coinage, and finally in that strangely characteristic emblem of the unicorn, the Macedonians appear to fill the role of the ancient Caledonians of Scotland, who remain to this day one of the leading and characteristic peoples of the world, although unhappily in numbers so limited through force of circumstances. Is it therefore any wonder that the Babylonians of York hailed Alexander the Great as their monarch? Warning, empty page. Chapter 7. St. Peter and York. Some of these old historians state that Peter was 7 years bishop of Antioch. That he preached also the gospel in Babylon, and in Britain. According to Mephrast's Rev. John P. Lawson, Ma. Bible Cyclopedia. We have seen the fate of Babylon after the death of Alexander, whereby Seleucus Nicator, who obtained Babylon with Syria, preferred to build his new capital on the hilltop of the city he named Antioch, also called Seleucia, and left Babylon as a city in decline, its fortifications having been dismantled finally by Darius, its palaces left in ruins, and its famous temple of Bel a mass of litter. The decision of Seleucus may be understood in the circumstances, but the fact that Seleucus acquired Babylon as a part of Syria is certainly a clear intimation that they went together, and could not have been widely separated. Yet few have paused to consider that the supposed sites of these two cities are separated, as though by an ocean, by a sweltering desert of some 750 miles. It is one of those ancient geographical facts to ponder over if the reader is still wedded to the fairy tale that these two important sites lay in the Orient. The only visible evidence of the alleged Babylon consists of mountains of earth, ruined brick walls, and a few scattered fragments. Nothing but Orthodox faith supports the claim of this site. The subsequent downhill career of the once famed city is scarcely noted in surviving history. Strange indeed, might it seem, that what had been the world's most powerful and wealthy metropolis, by force of circumstances deteriorated into almost a nameless area, largely deserted, its former name all but forgotten. Such, however, has been the fate of many famed cities of the past. The Parthians afford us one passing glimpse of Babylon. They had become a formidable people in the north, and as a result of the weakening of Syria by reason of the violent internecine wars of the Seleucidae to acquire the throne, much of their country had been absorbed by the Parthians, and in less than 20 years they held more than half of it, including Babylon. In the years 42 to 41 BC, they not only held practically all Syria, but dominated Judea, where a similar violent struggle for the throne was being waged by Antigonus in his efforts to supersede Hyrcanus, its rightful king and high priest. Antigonus bribed the king of Parthia's son with an offer of 1,000 talents, and 500 women, to obtain the crown for himself. The Parthians seized Hyrcanus in Jerusalem, and took him to Babylon, where he was given a suitable residence and treated with high respect by the Jewish population still remaining. He harbored the hope of returning to Jerusalem, but Antigonus contrived to have his ears sliced off, and as, according to Jewish sacred law, the high priest had to be physically whole, this mutilation automatically prevented his recovery of the high priesthood or the throne. 149. A few remarks here about the Parthians are pertinent to this investigation. Of the same Scythian or Gothic race as the Massagetae, who drew Cyrus to the far north of Europe and slew him, the Parthians were a warlike and brave people. Pomponius Mela says that the home of the Massagetae was in Sarmatia, where winter was continuous, and where they dwelt in underground caves. Herodotus says that they fed on raw fish and were clothed in sealskins. Their country Scythia was barren and bare, and Sarmatia began at the upper end of the Palus Maeotis, the Gulf of Bothnia, not the Sea of Azov, otherwise Finland, and northern Russia of today. This gains support from the fact that the Alani were a Parthian people, and the Aland Islands at the mouth of the Gulf of Bothnia still preserve their name. The Geti, Massagetae, Parthians, whose name Partha signified exiles, and Scythians, all racially were the same, and close. 149 Josephus, Antiquities, 14, 13, 1,2. Kindred with the Thracians, as one might compare the northern Scots with the Norwegians, who in turn were originally Caledonians or Picts. These Scythian people held their wives in common, and Dion tells an interesting story on this custom. The Empress Julia Augusta, wife of Severus, taunted the wife of Argentocoxus, a Parthian or Scythian king in Britain, about the promiscuous married intercourse between the sexes in Caledonia. The wife of Argentocoxus retorted that whereas in Britain women openly had intercourse with their finest men, in Rome they practiced secret adultery with the worst. 150. The Parthians, who for a time dominated Jerusalem and Syria, had previously been subject to the Macedonians and freed themselves in the reign of Antiochus Theos, grandson of Seleucus Nicator. The presence of the Parthians in the region of Syria and Jerusalem, otherwise in Britain, is explained in an account given by Herodotus of how, at a certain period, a body of Scythians, driven out of their homes by the Massagetae, emigrated, crossed the Araxes, Bosphorus or North Sea, and invaded the country of the Cimmerians. He gives a clue to the region by mentioning that the Cimmerian country was noted for its Cimmerian castles, probably the vitrified forts of northern Scotland, and one especial ferry of the Styx, and states that they renamed the land Scythia. 151 Scythia is the classic name for Scotland, although strangely there is no actual region so called. Nevertheless, the whole country became known as Scotland, or Scythialand. On the other hand we have Perthshire, which may be said to have derived its name from the Parthi, or exiles, hence Partheni. Farther south, in the direction of Stirling, we find the name Alan or Alan commonly as a place name, and it is not improbable that the Scythians of Herodotus came from the direction of the Aland country. This explanation enables us to realize that because Babylon, Syria, and Jerusalem became for a time subject to the Parthians, it reveals 150 Dio Cassius, History, LXXV1, 12. Argentocoxus was presumably a Scot or Scythian of Parthian descent. 151 Herodotus, 4, 12, 13. No necessary contact with Asia, but the very reverse. It throws a further light on the history of the past. To return then to Babylon. This former great city, eclipsed for long by Antioch, was overrun at various periods by many different invaders who exploited it and bled it white, as Diodorus says the Parthians did, leaving it in a condition of such poverty that it declined even more. Hence we revert to the mysterious Stratos Tower, which was described previously. It must have lain in a neglected state when Pompey overran Judea, for we are told that he caused to be restored the maritime cities of Joppa, Dora, and Stratos Tower. 152 as part of the terms he laid down to the Judaeans. 153 Herod, who came on the scene as regards this place some 50 years later, rebuilt it after a glorious manner, provided it with havens and dockyards, and most sumptuous palaces, regardless of cost, for whatever Herod's faults, he was princely in his lavishness. If it had been allowed to decay for some 300 years as a city whose very ownership was in dispute, for whilst it was actually in Syrian territory, Herod nonetheless restored it, it may explain the difficulty of its identification. Yet there were clues. It lay where Babylon had lain, it preserved at least the memory of a tower, reminiscent of the Tower of Babel, and it was situated on a tidal river which was easily accessible to the sea. Herod gave it the name of Caesarea, thus honoring Augustus Caesar, his patron, hence the city of Caesar. It became, as was doubtless understood from the first, the metropolis of the Roman overlords, their governing and military center, for Herod in effect ceded the restored city to them, although it was not really his to cede. In erecting colossi of Augustus and of imperial Rome, he was rendering homage to the Gentiles. Josephus recognized this abasement in regard to Caesarea. He says about it, "The apology which Herod made to the Jews for these things was this, that all was done not out of his own inclinations but by the 152 Herodotus, 2. 153 Josephus, Wars, 1, 9, 7. Commands and injunctions of others to please Caesar and the Romans, as though he had not the Jewish customs in his eye as he had the honor of those Romans. 154. Herod, however, in this matter, was probably more discriminating than was Josephus. He knew his Rome well, and all his chief men. He doubtless had pressure brought to bear on him, was reminded of the undertaking made to Pompey, and was thus called upon to fulfill the same. Note the words, commands and injunctions to please Caesar. The wise and far-seeing Augustus who, we may properly suspect, did visit Britain, recognized the necessity of a convenient port and headquarters to check the ambitions and warring tendencies of the Judaeans. Herod had to weigh up which was the more vital, to bow to Jewish customs or keep friendly with the Romans, and decided on the latter. It was a very big and expensive operation, which Herod carried out regally. Although it began in 22 BC, it was not completed until 10 BC, 12 years later. It seems as though Augustus contributed indirectly to the expense, for in 14 BC, as mentioned earlier, he released the Jews in Britain from slavery and payment of tribute. This was a very wise move, for the Roman tribute was always a source of anger to them and, as they claimed, it was opposed to their religion to pay taxes to a Gentile ruler. In effect it may be said that indirectly Rome footed the bill. As far back as 22 BC, if not before, Augustus must have recognized the latent danger of intransigent Jewry, to which Caesarea was the answer. Its position, not far from the frontier, was an effective check on lawlessness. From the foregoing one other point emerges. They must have had a responsible government. If Augustus granted relief to the Jews in Britain from paying tribute, they must have been recognized as a self-governing state in order to be able to collect taxes or have them remitted. As they had kings, this was obviously the case. 154 Josephus, Antiquities, 15, 9, 5. The restoration and aggrandizement of Strato's tower to Caesarea, with its accompanying prosperity, led to considerable friction between the Jews and Syrians. The Jews claimed privileges because Herod had reconstructed and rebuilt the city and port, whilst the Syrians retorted with truth that it had always been their city and still was. This quarrel became more violent as time went on and led to fighting and bloodshed, which must have happened in the time of Saint Peter, whose considerable relationship to the city will be shown. For the moment I would recall that in AD 41, Peter baptized Cornelius, the Roman centurion, with his kindred and friends, in Caesarea. Philip, the deacon, also resided there, with his 4 daughters. When Paul sailed from Ptolemy to Jerusalem, his ship called at Caesarea on the passage, where he was warned that he would be arrested and thrown into prison in Jerusalem, which left the apostle undaunted. He was so arrested, but was taken to Caesarea for trial, as he was claiming Roman citizenship. Although Roman records of the period mention little about the tight grip Rome held on Jewry, the fact remains that Britain was fully exploited to meet Roman requirements, but the name Jew was doubtless later rigorously omitted or suppressed. We get only the name of the Silurians, Illyrians, 155 who disguise the true circumstances until the sequence of events is closely investigated. The danger spot lay always in the north, especially in the region of Edinburgh along the line of the Clyde-Forth Isthmus, where also the 155 ed. Note, the Silures remain a mystery to historians and, indeed, archaeologists. On very scant evidence they have been placed in Wales, and rocks and a whole age subsequently named after them set this notion in stone, as it were. There is officially no known etymology for the Silures. The name of the Illyrians, however, is deemed to be related to the Greek word illus, mud, slime, and 18th century descriptions of Celtic linguistics break down the name into its constituent phonemes. Mud or slime, CLAI or lide, ILUS, limus. Mud is from mid, it is about, slime is from silam, it is the about upon, clay is from ka-ly, the shutting or sticking upon, lide is from lid, it is upon, illus is from liu, it is upon, limus is from lmiu, it is the about upon, or the earth or slime sticking upon. Daniel R. Davis, Roland Jones, Celtic Linguistics, 1700 to 1850, pt 3. A postscript to the origin of language and nations, their name is redolent of the nature of the entrance to the land where the sons of Nimrod settled after they chased the Celestial, White Stag. C. Bigelow, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Isles of Wonder, Resonance Bookworks. Caledonians and their allies were constantly waging guerrilla warfare, which compelled Orosius, in AD 47, to build his great military camp at Camulodunum, where Falkirk now stands, in order to hold them in check. At that period two events were prominent in the world history. Claudius in AD 43 ordained war against the Silures, which became general and never-ending, and the other was the growing opposition and rebelliousness on the part of the Jews towards the Romans, upon whom they sometimes inflicted severe defeat. They regarded the Romans as foreign and grasping enemies, as they were. Events recorded as in Britain at this period can only be gauged in conjunction with the Jewish or Silurian wars against the Romans and vice versa. One aspect of Roman policy may be touched upon, namely the assiduity with which Rome cultivated the sons of British princes, encouraging them to set native princes against one another. Before Julius Caesar first invaded Britain's shores, he had Comyns Atrebus, a British prince suffering under a grievance, to aid him, and later used in like manner Mandubratius, whose father, king of Trinovantum, had been killed by Cassibelanus, which was Caesar's excuse for making war. Cassibelanus' son, Tenuantius, was brought up in Rome and stood in high favor with Augustus, and his son Cunobelin, who withstood Claudius, was also educated in Rome and accompanied Augustus in several of his campaigns. Herod, likewise, knew Rome well, and sent his sons and his grandson there to be educated. It suited Rome. Herod the Great, an Egemean by origin, i.e., an Edomite or Cornishman, of no great lineage, obtained the throne of Judea by a series of seamy maneuvers including assassination, bribery and corruption, and by assiduous cultivation of Rome. He made friendship with the Caesars the axis of his policy and maintained it by lavish gifts and bribes. The period when Caesarea became the Roman metropolis in Britain was coincident with the growing wealth of the Jewish people, and Josephus stresses the immense sums which flowed into the treasury of the temple, coming, as he says, from all parts of the habitable earth. This wealth led to great ostentation on the part of the Herods. At the funeral of Herod his body was carried on a purple bier embroidered with precious stones and covered with purple cloth. On his head was placed the diadem and above it a golden crown. Succeeded later by Agrippa, who had in turn cultivated and bribed the Emperor Claudius, we learn that his income was 12 million drachmae, something like 1 million sterling at present values, and yet that of Herod the Great was half as much again. Agrippa, like his grandfather, maintained that aspect of ostentation, perhaps to influence the Romans and buy privileges. We have the dramatic story of how, in the 4th year of his reign, he expressly showed himself to the people of Strato's Tower, now become Caesarea, perhaps to influence the Romans there. Adorned in a costume made wholly of silver, and of wonderful texture, he appeared before an immense concourse in the amphitheatre where he sat enthroned, and as the sun's morning rays fell upon his garment and reflected its brilliancy, so resplendent did he appear as to seem divine to his subjects, many of whom hailed him as a god. He presently had occasion to look up and perceived, seated on a rope above his head, an owl, and, says the account, he immediately understood that this bird was the harbinger of ill tidings. 156. This indeed was the case, for he was shortly after attacked by the most agonizing pains, and in 5 days was a corpse. To our modern eyes this exhibitionism may savor of vulgarity, but it is not unlikely that Agrippa, who also knew his Rome where he was brought up, deliberately used these methods to impress the Romans with the greatness of the Judean kingdom and staged the scene in Caesarea accordingly. Agrippa was highly popular with his subjects, not least by causing James, the apostle, to be beheaded, and having just recently flung Peter into prison. Cuspius Fagus had at that time just been appointed procurator in Caesarea by Claudius, the first official representative there. 156. Josephus, Antiquities, 19, 8, 2. Although Caesarea lay actually in Syria at the time in question, it was accounted as on the southern border of Judea owing to Herod the Great having acquired from the Romans the rulership of these parts, to which the Judeans had no legitimate claim. In this same year, AD 44, Claudius ostentatiously proclaimed Britannia, including the Orcades, a province of the empire, and gave his young son the title of Britannicus. 157 Henceforth, the erstwhile decayed Babylon was now rejuvenated and glorified as the Roman seat of power, as Caesarea. It suggests possibly a clever ruse on the part of the Jews, who had lost their independence, that instead of being ruled in Jerusalem, Herod had succeeded by flattering the Romans, to persuade them to place their headquarters as far away as practicable from the cities. The position of Caesarea as a Jewish city remained equivocal for many years. In AD 55, the long-simmering quarrel between the Jews and Syrians, the latter referred to by Josephus as crux, came to a head with violent fighting and bloodshed. The Jews claimed that Caesarea was their city and demanded privileges, because it had been built by Herod, but the Syrians retorted that it was a Syrian city long before. 158. The Jews outnumbered the Syrians, but Felix, the Roman procurator, attacked and slew a great many of them, and Festus, who followed Felix, found the Jews included large numbers of guerrillas, and executed many. This guerrilla war was fought so bitterly that to all intents and purposes the Jewish rebels were for a time decimated. In AD 65, Florus being procurator, over 20,000 Jews were killed in Caesarea and others were sent to the galleys. The Jewish nation, greatly enraged, made war on the Roman dependencies in Galilee and elsewhere, especially against the Syrians. 159 The situation became so serious that Nero selected Vespasian to take command and to compel the Jews to lay down 157 Watt more. As explained later, the names of Britain and Britannia were used by the Romans as relating to Scotland. England and Wales had long before been conquered under various other names. 158 Josephus, Wars, 2, 8, 7. 159 Ibid, 2, 18, 1-3. Their arms, for the Roman forces in Syria under Cestius were completely defeated and only saved themselves from annihilation by flight. 160. Vespasian knew Britain well, for he had been sent in the first place by Claudius in AD 43, not only as his leading general but because he had originally earned his reputation there and was aware of the sort of opposition he would have to encounter. Vespasian's policy was to avoid open war with Judea if possible, the more so as, according to Josephus, the whole country was in a state of anarchy, with uprisings, massacres, destruction of towns, and highway robbery. Cestius Gallus, the president of the province of Syria, sent to Nero asking for immediate aid to meet the very serious situation not only in Judea and Jerusalem, but in the two Galilees, Wales and Somerset, also. The Jews had made themselves so generally hated by their overbearing practices that cities like Tyre, Ptolemy, Scythopolis, Ascalon, Gadara, and Damascus, all rose against them. In Damascus over 10,000 Jews were slaughtered. Antioch and Sidon were outstanding as having spared them. Cestius, like his predecessors, had his headquarters at Antioch, the capital of Syria. 161 This was the general situation when Vespasian, joined a little later by Titus, crossed over to Syria. Vespasian, bringing with him 2 legions, the 5th and 10th, went to Ptolemy, where he was joined a little later by Titus. In the reconstruction of Bible geography, Ptolemy, the original Philistin Ekron, a port in the later lower country of Galilee, was situated in England near the northwest border of Dorset, near the Uxella or Somerset Sea, or Lake of Galilee, whence the Fossway led directly to Lincoln, originally Antioch, a more convenient center for his objective at that particular time than Caesarea. Ptolemy may have been on the site of the ancient Somerton. 160 Ibid, 2, 19, 7-8. Except for passing mentions by Eutropius, the island was then in an uproar. In history, 7, Tacitus, Agricola, 13, and Suetonius' biography of Vespasian in Lives of the 12 Caesars, we have practically no details of this period. It should be noted that they use the Romano-British names in their work, but Josephus uses the Greek or biblical names. 161 Josephus, Wars, 2, 18-20. A brief account of Vespasian's activities before he proceeded to Jerusalem to finish off the war against the Jews may be gathered from Josephus. After organizing his forces, he marched first into Lower Galilee, Somerset, took Gadara, now Clifton, and set it on fire, and also destroyed neighboring places, probably including the city of Bath. He dispatched Pedilius Cerealis with the 5th Legion, 600 horse and 3,000 other troops, against the Sarmatians in Gerizim, near Worcester, who refused his terms and lost 11,600 men, slain or massacred. 162. This gives us some idea of the ferocity of the campaign. In 69, the year when Jerusalem was first besieged, sedition and civil war prevailed over Judea, says Josephus, who was himself involved in it. Vespasian, who had occupied Caesarea, proceeded to march against those places in Judea not yet overthrown. Cerealis meanwhile had been laying waste all that part of Edomia called the Upper Edomia, which then incorporated all the region south of the Cotswold Hills, as far east as Cirencester, including the north of Wiltshire. He went for instance to Hebron, another very ancient city, which I have shown in my previous volume to have applied to the area around Avebury. He broke into it and burned it. 163. The site corresponds with Barbury Castle, lying north of Avebury Circle, a massive ruin with prodigious outworks. All these attacks, then in the Judean sphere of interest, were a preliminary to the main campaign, for Jerusalem, as Josephus says, was what the Romans aimed at. 164. Cerealis, mentioned in the foregoing, was with Titus the leading general serving under Vespasian, whose relative he was, and all are known in British records. Cerealis became a little later praetor at Caesarea. From this summary of events from the years 57 to 70, we may return to the question of Strato's Tower, by then Caesarea, which fits into the situation as it should do. When past history is analyzed, the pedigree of York, formerly Eboracum or Caesarea, earlier Strato's Tower, and originally Babylon or Iraq, becomes an assured fact. There it stands today, situated in the south of the northern state in what was then a no-man's land, yet threatening the northern capital, a city built in a flat plain, with a river not far distant from the sea, and title all the 162 Ibid, 3, 7, 32. Many of these figures used by Josephus should be accepted with reserve. 163 Ibid. 164 Ibid, 6, 2, 5. Waypoint 165 with Edinburgh, the original Jerusalem. This formerly decayed city offered obvious powerful strategic advantages to the Romans and enabled Herod to gratify his ebullient character. The identification of York as originally Babylon, then as Strato's Tower, and finally as Caesarea, leads us to another clue of considerable interest and importance to historians and many others. We know that St. Peter was associated with Caesarea. Was he also with York? This important subject possesses a considerable bearing on the origins of Christianity. St. Peter, chief of the apostles, was no stranger to Caesarea. Most of his life after the crucifixion was spent in preaching and converting Gentiles as well as Jews in Jerusalem, Antioch, and Caesarea. In his epistle to the Galatians, 2:11, St. Paul mentions that Peter visited the flourishing church of Antioch in Syria, but he does not mention Caesarea. Peter mentions it himself, but as we shall see refers to it as Babylon, as it could justly yet be termed. One notable feature of his early activities in Caesarea is that recorded of Cornelius, the devout Roman centurion, who had a vision and was told to send to Joppa and call for one Simon, whose surname is Peter, Acts 10:5, how he dispatched 3 of his personal servants to invite Peter to Caesarea, how on the day following, the apostle accompanied the men and was escorted to the house of Cornelius, who had invited his kinsmen and close friends to hear Peter expound the word of God. 166 They were among the first Gentiles to be converted, but, owing to the bigotry of the period and the Jewish attitude towards Gentiles, even the apostles in Jerusalem protested until Peter convinced them that he had received a celestial vision and had obeyed the Spirit. Some 2 years later, Agrippa, who had slain the apostle James, son of Zebedee, to curry favor with his subjects in Jerusalem, threw Peter into prison, but by some miraculous intervention he escaped, and went into another place. Acts 12:17. After Agrippa's death, if not before, Caesarea became an entirely Roman city, although largely inhabited by Syrians and Jews. 165 Ed note, the Ouse is tidal up to Naburn Locks, 3 miles below York, but in former times the tides reached the city itself, according to the official guide to York, p. 20. In early times, a series of forts lined the Humber to York. 166 Acts, CHSX, and 11. Most of St. Peter's later life is uncertain, and although it is often claimed that he visited Rome and was executed there, no such evidence exists. It is true that the Vatican claims to possess his pontifical chair, but if so it seems more likely that it was originally at York. True, that Constantine built and dedicated the first St. Peter's Church to the Apostle, but Constantine, who knew his York well indeed, had strong motives for transferring the activities of the chief apostles from their real setting to Rome, as will be duly seen. It has always mystified ecclesiastical students that Peter concludes his first epistle to the Romans with these words. The church that is at Babylon, elected together with you, saluteth you, and so doth Marcus, my son. I Peter, 5:13. Why did he use the words at Babylon? What possible relationship could he possibly have had with Babylon, for centuries a ruin and totally forgotten? In their dilemma many have proposed that it was merely a synonym for Rome, surely a far-fetched pretext because if Peter had meant Rome why say Babylon? This challenging name, as may have been intended, throws a light upon the inscrutable deception regarding the past history of the world and of the earliest days of Christianity. My readers, of course, can furnish the solution. Caesarea was Babylon, and St. Peter's main mission among the Gentiles was there, in Caesarea, otherwise York. To be meticulously correct, Babylon was the correct name for the saint's mission and activity on the left bank of the Ouse, which was Babylon, whereas the right bank, where stood originally Borsippa, was later the Roman capital Eboracum or Caesarea, a colonia. This compels the question, did St. Peter become the first Christian bishop of York? Archaeological pointers and place names fully suggest it. East of the present noble minster is Peter Gate, leading to the entrance of the minster, and adjoining the gate are High Peter Gate and Low Peter Gate, while in the same neighborhood is placed the Bedern, originally the Peterna, in past centuries definitely associated with the apostle. The English ambassador who attended the Council of Basel in 1431 claimed that St. Peter came to the world in the Peterna, which could be interpreted as relating to his episcopal character. 167 This is an historical claim which deserves careful thought, coming from such a source. 167 Canon James Reign, York, p. 21. York in fact teems with nomenclature relating to the apostle. Athelstan erected St. Peter's Hospital in the 10th century on his conversion to Christianity. Ruins of St. Peter's, later St. Leonard's, Hospital, York. Also notable is St. Peter's School, and, in addition to St. Peter's Church, there were exceptional privileges which continued until a recent period, entitled the Liberty of St. Peter, the enclosure originally to the Minster area, St. Peter's Prison, Peter's Pence, and, in connection with the Liberty of St. Peter, an ecclesiastical regnum in regno, whereby the church authorities within its own bailiwick were an independent body. To cite Allen, the well-known historian of Yorkshire, the Liberty of St. Peter comprehends all those parts of the city and county of York which belong to the Church of St. Peter. The jurisdiction is separate and exclusive, and it has its own magistrates, steward, bailiffs, and constables. 168. There must be considerable doubt whether Cerialis built a fortress on the later site of the Minster, and whether its liberty as claimed by archaeologists can be substantiated. It is more probable that in AD 71 he erected one on the opposite bank of the river where now stands the Old Bail to protect the colonia at a very critical period of warfare against the Jews or Silures. The Roman wall which embraced the area of the present Minster had very little military value. Covering a considerable area, it possessed only 2 corner towers, one near Monk's Bar, the other at the extreme opposite angle. Nor does it appear that the surrounding walls were of any great height or strength. 168 Allen, History of the County of York, p. 316. It should be recalled that in the early days of the Christian faith, owing to the hostility faced from Jewish mob violence, it was quite usual to fortify churches. Temple Brewer, at Lincoln, not far away, was strongly fortified with embattled towers. If Constantius, the husband of Helena, a most pious Christian lady, and his son Constantine, who later took the faith to Rome from Britain, erected the multi-angular tower, his motive could well have been to protect a later church built on the site. There can be no doubt that the ecclesiastical supremacy of York was unique in the early days of Christianity, and we find all the place names relating to St. Peter exist in the vicinity of the present minster sacred to the Apostle, such as Peter Gate, the dungeon, discovered in 1816, on the site of a former chapel of St. Sepulchre, also Peter Prison, and the Hall of Pleas for the Liberty of St. Peter. They must have been instituted at an early date when the liberty was established, yet to contend that the earliest church of St. Peter was erected in the center of a military fortress, of which no sign or indication has been found, renders its site very doubtful. A remarkable feature of ecclesiastical York is its ancient city seal. Allen describes its obverse as showing St. Peter, with his cross keys, standing between two angels, each holding a candle, with the inscription Sbi Petri Principes Apostolar, which may be interpreted as Sedes Britannis Insulas Petri Principes Apostolorum. The see, or seat, in the British Isles of Peter, chief of the Apostles 169. Its reverse depicts an edifice with 3 towers or turrets and one larger inscribed Sigillum Civium Eberassi, the seal of the city of Eberacum. The implication of these claims appears unmistakable, for the sense is that St. Peter was the Bishop of York and that here was his seat or see. It refutes the claim of Rome, which was not recognized by York. 169 Allen, History of the County of York, p. 234. In Heraldry of York Minster, p. 382, Dean Puri Cust translates the lettering on the obverse of the seal as Sigillum Beati, i.e., the seal of the blessed. The use of S as sigillum is invidious as it is fully set out on the reverse. Also, the 3 letters SBI are separate, each to indicate a word, not to make Beati out of BI. Why was it that, at a time when Rome could actively intervene, the patron saint of York became Saint William, who was its bishop in 114 and was only canonized in 1284? Reign, p. 156. Why was St. Peter ignored? Before the 11th century, such a city seal could not have been designed and approved centuries ago without a very strong proof of its correctness as to St. Peter. History indicates how anxious the Vatican became, in the centuries following Constantine, to get York to conform, regarding it as the most important of the primatial cities. It was always earmarked for an archbishopric directly it joined the Roman Communion. 170 and then it beatified St. William, in order to eradicate St. Peter where possible. When we summarize these factual matters and recognize that York was originally Babylon, then Strato's Tower, then Caesarea, we can fully understand why St. Peter used the word Babylon and also the words, the church that is at Babylon, elected together with you, meaning the Roman colonia who had approved of his mission, like Cornelius, and possibly many more. The arms of the ancient minster stand out as a challenge to those who conform to the belief that St. Peter and the apostles were teaching Christianity in the Near East. They further indicate the importance of the early church in York, where St. Peter established himself, with his son Marcus, leading to the belief that here he spent his declining years. What also, in relation to the ancient seals, is to be said of the edifice like a church, with 3 towers or turrets and one larger tower? As Allen truly says, history is nearly silent respecting York from the Roman period until the year 1137, in the reign of King Stephen 171. We know that the Romans were succeeded by Saxons, originally Syrians, and that in 627 the first York minster was said to be built. Edwin of Northumbria, converted to Christianity when he married Ethelburga, was baptized in a little wooden house on this spot, says the official guide, and he built a stone church round it, but not a trace remains of either of these little churches, nor is it known exactly where the site if either of them was. 172 Later 2 other churches were erected on the site of the minster, one in 767 to 780, which was destroyed by William the Conqueror, and on its foundation a massive Norman church was built between 1070 to 1100. Finally, from approximately 1220 onward, the present minster was begun. 170 It is possible that when Papal Rome became predominant, not before AD 330, it adopted the arms and claim of St. Peter from the original site in York. 171 Allen, History of the County of York, p. 227. 172 Official Guide to York, p. 13. The claim is self-contradictory. Another York antiquity whose past history is mysteriously confused is Clifford's Tower. Situated adjoining the present castle, successor of previous fortresses and now a museum, on the left, or Babylon, bank of the Ouse, opposite the Old Bail, stands this strange tower on an artificial mound 40 feet in height, 360 feet in circumference, and of peculiar design. Professor Hamilton Thompson, in his work Military Architecture, terms it a tower with a forebuilding. The latter outer part or central portal was said to have been repaired or erected by Robert de Clifford in about 1250. In 1190, it is said to have been the scene of a massacre of Jews, who were then numerous and disliked. A mass of Jews threatening the tower, who were consequently massacred, may present a clue to its history. The Jewish Massacre, York, 1190. Canon Rain and others appear to believe that when William the Conqueror was threatened by an uprising in the north and in Mercia, in 1068, and erected a new castle at York on the site of a former one, that it was Clifford's Tower. 173 I contend with all respect that the Reverend Canon Rain and others are misled. William required an adequate fortress to withstand the determined onset of his powerful opponents, and the castle he built would have been far more probably on the site of the present castle adjoining Clifford's Tower, with its protecting banks and river. Furthermore, when we are told it was built in great haste, would the warlike king have erected a fancy design divided into 4 quarters and, for a fortress, of such insignificant size? The walls are described as early English, but the entrance was directed from the present adjoining castle site, by means of a drawbridge and a flight of steps up the artificial mound. It may have been later used as a keep, but Allen compares its design with the castle of St. Angelo in Rome, and that was Hadrian's mausoleum. 174. As a defensive fortress it is utterly ill-suited for any prolonged defense, and the idea is an insult to the memory of the conqueror. On its upper floor it has in its very center the remains of a chapel, a most unusual adjunct of a military edifice, but possibly related to the Jewish uprising in 1190. And note this fact, the tower's true design is of 2 ancient Roman keys. Was it associated with the keys of St. Peter? It is erected also on an artificial rocky height, recalling the biblical statement, "Thou art Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and I will give thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven." Matthew 15, 18-19. York is St. Peter's city, and here we find the rock, the 2 keys design, and evidence of a chapel. In addition, with its 3 towers or turrets and 1 larger square in its design, it may, without any straining for effect, explain the reverse of the ancient city seal. Thus, in the ruined Clifford's Tower, it is possible we may view the first church of St. Peter, built according to divine precept, the Paeterna. I advance the proposal as one worthy of the close consideration of the citizens of York and of the world in general. It fits in with all that has preceded it, proving the actual presence of St. Peter himself in Caesarea, which he rightly calls Babylon. 173 Rain, York p. 51. 174 Allen, p. 353. Here, in fact, may well stand the remains of the little church which Edwin of Northumbria built of stone when he became converted to Christianity. It agrees with the early English in its masonry. Subsequently, with the rapid extension of the faith, the later churches were thus transferred to a more suitable site. There is one further observation anent to this. When Jesus made the utterance relating to Peter and his church, he had just arrived by ship into the coasts of Caesarea Philippi, 16:13, always a place mystifying to Bible students who imagine it as some other Caesarea, although the Romans had none other in the Holy Land. The description was of the Caesarea of Philip, the notable early deacon and evangelist, with 4 daughters who prophesied, who resided in Caesarea and in whose house Paul, the apostle, stayed after sailing thence from Ptolemy, Acts 21:8. Confusion has arisen because there was Philippi in northern Macedonia, visited by Paul, but it was not a Caesarea, nor anywhere near the region of the one Caesarea. 16:12. It was therefore when Jesus reached Peter's city that he uttered the famous words appropriate to the scene, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock, pi epsilon tau rho omicron, I will build my church." The Jews present another significant sidelight on York. Canon Rain opines that they possibly found their way to York at a very early period. As we have seen, they claimed Caesarea as their city, although the Syrians denied it, but they were numerous and wealthy. They had their quarter in Jubbergate and their burial ground at Jubberi. Tradition says that they had their own synagogue, later named St. Dion's, Zion Church, probably on the site of St. Samson's Church in the former Jewish quarter. They were both disliked and feared. Archbishop Egbert, circa 734, forbade any Christian to fraternize with them, and later they were expelled. London, Damascus, also at an early time possessed a large Jewish population, as also did Leicester, Lystra, and Derby, Derb. The Danes, who made many raids and invasions upon York, were also called Jutes, said in an ancient Danish record to be Jews of the tribe of Dan, who migrated to Denmark at a long distant time. It was they who called the former Eberacum Jorvik or Horvik, a variation of its original name of Erak, derived from Hercules, or Heracles, also Ak or Eric. Hence the name Jericho. Thus York, with Edinburgh, offers the most amazing clue to the true course of world history through the ages. Chapter 8. York and the Cool Dees. I have been in many places where history is hospitably at home, and is not merely an unwilling guest, but for my pleasure in the past. I could not choose any place before York. William Dean Howells. Without any wish to complicate the vicissitudes of York under its various names and rulers, as Iraq, Babian, Stratos Tower, or Caesarea, there is one other point of significance of which it is essential to make mention. That is, as Jericho, another biblical name for York, which was Syrian and never an Israelite city at all. If Erech and Babylon were one and the same, it explains the derivation of York, or Horvik, with Herc, Yules, or Herak, lay, the great semi-divinity. Similarly Jericho, as Jericho, is related, variations being doubtless in accordance with the various dialects of those who inscribed them. And Jericho occupied this self-same region. But what of York's other name, Eber, Latinised into Eberacum? In British traditions, it was founded by E. Browk, a man of tall stature and of marvellous strength, a description immediately suggestive of Nimrod. This E. Browk, we are told, named it Caer E. Browk after himself, who also founded Mount Agneth, Edinburgh, and the city of Al-Clud, Dumbarton, which legendary origin is placed by Geoffrey as in the time of King David of Israel. 175 According to the same Geoffrey, E. Browk himself reigned in York, and his sons, under Assaracus, departed in a fleet to Germany, subdued the barbarian people there and obtained that kingdom. 176 This Assaracus would appear to correspond with Ashur, who went forth from Babel. 175 Geoffrey of Monmouth, History of the Kings of Britain, 2, 7. 176 Ibid, 2, 8. And Erech and built Nineveh and other cities. The name E. Browk is of course related to York as the origin of Eber and Eberacum, being originally derived from Boreas, the north. Ebrauch seems, in fact, to be an eponym for Nimrod. In both Babylon and York later this root Bor survived, for the new city or suburb which Nebuchadnezzar built preserved it in Borsippa, and that same area, which originally was inhabited by the Chaldean Magi, especially those, as Diodorus tells us, who studied astronomy, was doubtless occupied far later by the Romans, and was the real Caesarea. Rain says that from the right bank of the Ouse to Mick-Leggett Bar, and from Clementhorpe to North Street Postern, the area must have been filled with public buildings and private residencies of which numerous fragments have been found, including tessellated pavements and public baths. Everything testifies to the presence for a considerable period of a very large population. 177 It was strongly walled and points to its having been the aristocratic and most important area of the city. Jericho, for its part, remains always a mystery city in biblical records. Except for its invasion and overthrow by Joshua, it played no part in Israel's history. The only notable reference to it is that when David had designs on Rabbath-Ammon and his ambassadors were roughly treated, having their beards half cut off and their nether garments slit off them, he told them to stay in Jericho and keep out of the way until their beards had grown, as they were ashamed to show themselves in so ignominious a plight before their own people. 2 Samuel 10, 4-5. Joshua's invasion and siege belongs entirely to the pre-Exodus period, which was that of Moses, and relates to the time of the great catastrophe. Joshua was a soldier of Moses, and from other indications it would seem that the Assyrians attacked and destroyed Jericho, or Babylon, but a little later all the invaders fled away and returned to their homes following the loss of their vast army, and encamped not far from Jerusalem, as related in my book Britain, The Key to World History. 177 Reign, York, p. 8. Joshua 1, 4, according to the text, was told by the Lord to cross the river Jordan. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, Mount Snowdon, even unto the great river, Euphrates, North Sea, all the land of the Hittites, Hate or Syrians, and unto the great sea, Atlantic, towards the going down of the sun, shall be your coast. 178. As I interpret these words, Jericho was Joshua's special objective, approaching it from North Wales and marching to the North Sea. He sent 2 spies who entered the city and lodged in the house of a harlot named Rahab. 2, 1. The house was built on the top of the wall which surrounded the city, and the spies were let down by a rope and escaped. The walls were immensely high and strong, and, with houses on their summit, compare with those of Babylon. In the siege we have the fantastic explanation of how, with some 40,000 men prepared for battle, surrounding it, 7 priests blew on their horns until on the 7th day the wall fell flat, and the besiegers entered and slew all except Rahab and her family. Joshua's men sacked it and removed all its treasures in gold and silver. Joshua 6, 9-25, 179. Thus it was a wealthy city at that time. One of Joshua's followers, a man of Judah, stole a goodly Babylonian garment, 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold. 7, 21. This dress Josephus describes as a royal garment woven entirely of gold. 180. The city's wealth, its king, its enormous walls with houses atop, and this royal garment, all point to Babylon as the city affected. 178. That Joshua's campaign related to the later period of Israel's history, by my revised chronology, is confirmed by the account, 10, 11-13, of how in a battle with the Amorites the sun stood still for almost a whole day, and how great stones fell and destroyed others. 179. Joshua, representing the invading Sakai, possessed firearms, the rods of the Assyrians, and his horns were pieces of ordnance with which he blew down a section of the walls. He explained, 24:12, the victory to his followers later at Shechem. I sent the hornet before you, which drave them out from before you, even the 2 kings of the Amorites, but not with thy sword nor with thy bow. The hornets represented bullets and horns were guns, also called trumpets of ram's horns. Note also in Exodus 23:28, I will send the hornets before thee, which shall drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite, from before thee. Another mention of the hornet is found in Deuteronomy 7:20. Britain, the key to world history. 180 Josephus, Antiquities, v. 1, 10. That Jericho was Babylon is clearly revealed by its geographical situation. It stood in a plain, with a river, and is referred to as the city of palm trees, a curious distinction as though the palm were a special or unusual type related to it. This particular aspect deserves attention, for Josephus also says, "This country, Jericho, bears that balsam which is the most precious drug that grows there alone." The place bears also palm trees, both many in number and excellent of their kind. 181 But Babylon also had palm trees, for Xenophon describes that Cyrus, in his siege of Babylon, dug a deep trench and built towers upon the river bank, laying their foundation with palm trees not less than 100 feet in length, and palm trees, that are pressed by a weight, bend up under it like asses used to carrying loads. 182 Observe that they were long trees, and that their soft wood made them easily pressed into position. Babylon, like Jericho, thus possessed plenty of palms. But what did the ancients intend by these palm trees? The palm we know flourishes in hot, sandy soils, but in Josephus' works we are frequently told of snow, cold, and ice, in Syria, Judea, and Galilee, and although our northern climate has deteriorated and become more damp and moist through the ensuing centuries, tropical palms could not have flourished some 2,000 years ago, or we should have found traces. It was actually balsam, called balm of Gilead, which grew profusely at Jericho, as Josephus describes. When Pompey had pitched his camp at Jericho, where the palm tree grows, and that balsam which is an ointment of all the most precious, which upon any incision made in the wood with a sharp stone, distills out thence like a juice. 183 This surely relates to the balsam poplar tree, which, regarding which an authority in arboriculture who dwells at Beverly, near York, kindly informs me, there is the balsam poplar tree, common about these parts, with fragrant, sticky shoots. 184 The reference of Xenophon to the tallness of these trees recalls William of Malmesbury, previously cited, who, writing of the fenlands which formerly closely approached York, mentions, goodly trees which for tallness strived to. 181 Josephus, Antiquities, 4, 2. 182 Xenophon, 7, 5, 10. 183 Josephus, Antiquities, 14, 4, 1. 184 Personal communication from C. Eve, Newbiggin, Beverly. Reach up to the stars. The balsam poplar is a tall tree, and thrives in damp, marshy soil, as much of the southern plain of York was, formerly. Another clue to Jericho's site is the scriptural account of how Zedekiah, fleeing from Jerusalem, was captured in the plain of Jericho, and was taken to Hamath, where his eyes were put out. Now, Hamath, also called Great Hamath, by the river Euphrates, indicated a river mouth, and answers to the estuary of the Humber, which long ago covered a much wider area than today. A city or town in Hamath named Riblah, may be represented by the present Ripley, an ancient site, a little to the north of Harrogate, which Nebuchadnezzar made his military headquarters when he besieged Jerusalem. Pharaoh Necho earlier, from the west, went to Riblah and summoned thither Jehoahaz, king of Judea, after his first victory by the Euphrates, and placed Jehoahaz in chains. 2 Kings, 22-33. Riblah lay in or near Hamath, as it lies in the plain of York, a very ancient settlement. Another pointer to the site of Jericho was when Pompey marched from Damascus against Jerusalem, on the occasion when two Judean princes were fighting one another savagely for the Jewish throne and high priesthood. The two had fought a battle near Jericho before Pompey arrived, in which the troops of Hyrcanus, the high priest, deserted him for Aristobulus. They came to a compromise which Pompey disliked, and the Roman general sent for Aristobulus, who fled from him to a place called Alexandrium, in the area of Corea, whence Pompey followed him on his road to Jerusalem. In Yorkshire, as mentioned, was Corey or Corey, near Doncaster, which stretched northwards to the vicinity of Harrogate, whence the Corytani tribe possibly acquired their name. Some 2 miles south of Harrogate stands Alexander's Hill, a high, isolated mount on whose hilltop are the remains of an ancient military camp of size. Josephus mentions Pompey and Alexandrium as follows. He came to Corea, which is the first entrance into Judea when one passes over the Midland countries, where he came to a most beautiful fortress that was built at the top of a mountain called Alexandrium, whither Aristobulus had fled, and thence Pompey sent his commands to him, that he should come to him. 185. 185 Josephus, Antiquities, 14, 3, 4. Pompey's camp was pitched at Jericho, York, and Alexandrium can be represented by Alexander's Hill, some 18 miles west of York in that area. Josephus also mentions the citadel Cypros of Jericho, on the site of the earlier palace, and says that Herod built a wall round this castle, a very strong and fine building, commemorating his mother, and named it Cypros. 186. The description could well apply to the site of the present Castle Museum in the near vicinity of Clifford's Tower. Proceeding from Jericho, Pompey led his army onward to Jerusalem, and alluded to Strato's Tower, its usual name, but his movements indicate that Jericho was simply the Hebrew name for the city. Whether he was commissioned by Rome to put down the continuous anarchy and wars fomented by the Jews, as in the case of the two Jewish brothers who, for their own ambitious and selfish purposes, had plunged the whole country into war and were destroying lives and property to the prejudice of Roman interests, history does not record. What it does record is that Pompey, in this campaign, annexed Syria on behalf of the Roman Empire, which included Strato's Tower or Jericho, the later Roman Caesarea. When he had defeated the Jews, he issued orders to them to improve or reconstruct as strategic ports Joppa, the port of Jerusalem, Dora, lying between Jerusalem and Strato's Tower, and also the last named city. He doubtless had his eye on future needs and decided to make these ports efficient in case of future operations. The subsequent Roman internecine wars and struggles for power probably caused the postponement until Herod the Great was pressed to complete the work, at least so far as Strato's Tower was concerned. This geographical event utterly fails to obtain any adequate explanation by either classical or biblical maps which attribute the terrain as happening in the Near East. Antioch, for instance, is placed over 300 miles distant from Strato's Tower or Caesarea, which is given as in the south of Syria, as is correct, but also as in the province of Samaria, with which it was not concerned. 186 Josephus, Antiquities, 16, 5, 2. The name Cypros is Greek, as are Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, as well as Alexander and many others in Josephus' works. That Judea was the Greek Illyria explains the close relationship between them. That Pompey first made Judea subject to Rome is recognized by Josephus in a lament. He says, "The occasion of the misery which came upon Jerusalem were Hyrcanus and Aristobulus by raising a sedition the one against the other, for now we lost our liberty and became subject to the Romans and were deprived of the country which we had gained by our arms from the Syrians and were compelled to restore it to the Syrians." 187. When Pompey marched from where York now stands, he may have followed an ancient road through Great Driffield, suggested later as the plain of Dura, later Dara, beyond which lies Danes Dyke, an ancient earthwork of considerable size, stretching across Flamborough Head, adjoining which is Old Door, where is another earthwork, nearby being what a geologist describes as extraordinary contortions and crumblings in the beds of chalk at Old Door. 188 suggesting an earthquake in the region. Hereabouts, facing Filey Bay, may be said to have originally stood Dora, known locally as Old Door. 189 It can explain the directions given by Pompey as conqueror of Syria. Incidentally, Josephus' words cited above prove that Jericho lay in Syria and not Judea. Such being the case, it indicates how completely the so-called Jericho in the modern Palestine, placed about 12 miles from Jerusalem, in the heart of Judea, is untrue to authentic history. It so happens that the American School of Oriental Research, at Jerusalem, recently discovered, as this work is being completed, 190 or claim to have discovered, the ruins of ancient Jericho, near its present modern site. Professor Kelso, its director, declared that nothing like it has ever been found in Palestine. 191. A few years ago another professor of this school claimed to have discovered Ezion Geber in the Gulf of Aqaba, in Saudi Arabia, a fantastic site, completely incompatible with its biblical history in connection with Tarshish. 192. 187 Ibid, 14, 4, 5. 188 Thomas Shepard, Geographical Rambles in East Yorks, pp 55-6. 189 A. N. Cooper, Curiosities of East Yorks, pp 89-90. 190 Ed Note, that is to say, as Comyns Beaumont was completing the original manuscript. 191 London Observer, October 29, 1950. 192 Professor Glueck's discovery is discussed in Britain, the Key to World History. Before ending this part of the inquiry into the past, in which I have sought to prove that St. Peter, who dwelt in Joppa and moved to Caesarea when he escaped from Agrippa, where he founded his church, and addressed his epistle to the Romans as from Babylon, dwelt in York, it is necessary to revert to St. Paul and St. Barnabas, for both were laboring in the same regions, especially in Galatia. In past centuries in England, as late as in the reigns of Henry VII and Queen Mary, two most learned men, Polydore Virgil, the historian, and Cardinal Pole, both affirmed that Christianity first arose in Britain. The Cardinal, in his address to Philip of Spain and Mary, on the occasion of their wedding, stated that Britain was the first of all countries to receive the Christian faith. Saint Augustine said the same thing to Pope Gregory in AD 600. Thus Paul and Barnabas and other saints by this same token should have been converting the Gentiles in Britain. Such was, indeed, the case. Once again we must sort out confused geography stolen from its true surroundings and placed in utterly alien climes. Paul and Barnabas were very active in Galatia, to whose people was addressed the Pauline epistle, a region quite falsely attributed to Asia Minor. The Galatians possessed, among other cities converted by the apostles, Lystra and Derbe, names which should possess a familiar ring in British ears. We have seen that the Galati/Ai were Gauls or Gaels, originally Atlanteans of western Scotland, who originated in northern Europe, a complete contrast to the swarthy, black-haired and dark-eyed races of Asia Minor. Gauls there were in Belgium and France, called Gallia in consequence, and in Britain, mainly in the west, and in Ireland. Wherefore this presumed habitation of a famous northern or Aryan people in a portion of the present-day Turkish territories. Admittedly we usually accept without question the geography taught us in school books without weighing such implications, but it is time we took note that extensive search in Asia Minor for Lystra and Derbe and of the neighboring Antioch, has failed to find a trace of any of them. According to Marcian, cited by Watmore, Albion was situated in the region of Celto-Galatia. 193 We also learn that Galatia, in the time of Augustus, possessed kings and a rich aristocracy, and was inhabited by Celts whose peasants ploughed the soil, raised herds and sheep, and were known as brave archers. 194 They dwelt on either side of the channel, but those Galatians who were settled on the mainland of Europe, supposedly settled in Asia Minor, as at Ankara, Colossae, Gordium, Pteria, Pisidia, Phrygia and Lake Ascania, mainly east of the maritime Alps, and those more westerly called the Galli Ligs or Ligures, are not our immediate concern. The northern Galatai/E, described as dwelling in Lycaonia in Galatia, are another matter. They occupied the part of Celto-Galatia called Lycaonia, and later Mercia, the Flavia Caesarensis of Vespasian. This territory stretched across from the Humber to the Mersey, according to Canon Rain, but properly it stretched west from Lincolnshire to the Mersey. Sometimes described as Lycaonia, because it represented the northern Seps. 195 According to the astronomical myth whereby the daughter of Lycaon changed into a bear, and was translated to the constellation of the Pole, whence the Galatai/Ae had originated. Himilco, grandson of Hamilcar. Festus Avienus, whose poems describe in considerable detail the coastal regions of western Britain, in painting the voyages of 193 Watmore, Insulae Britannicae. Watmore says Marcian followed Ptolemy. 194 Ferrero, Greatness and Decline of Rome, v. p. 21. 195 Ed Note, September, a division of a family, especially a division of a clan. Himilco mentions how the navigator passed through the Estrum Nights, Channel Isles, reached the Insula Sacra, Ireland, abode of the Hiberni, near which lay Insula Albionum, England. Some of the Estrumnici in the north settled, he says, on the opposite coast from Hibernia to that of the Ligures, in the region of Lycaon 196. This Lycaonia, or Celto-Galatia, also called Liguria, was named Loegria or Loegrues in the Welsh Triads, as the Midlands next to Wales, with the coastland adjoining the Mersey. In this biblical area of Galatia, among other cities were Lystra and Derbe. According to Watmore, the ancient city of Leicester, which became the capital of Mercia, was originally named Ligura, whence the Ligures may have derived their name. 197. The descriptions of the apostolic voyages and travels of St. Paul and St. Barnabas are somewhat confusing because there were two Antiochs in which they preached. The more famous one was in Syria, the other being in Pisidia, near Lake Ascania, Heligoland Bay, and Phrygia, later Frisia. Paul and Barnabas, we are told, were in the church at Antioch in Syria, took ship and reached Antioch in Pisidia, where Paul attracted converts, but the Jews raised persecution and expelled them out of their coasts, Acts 13:50. They thus shook off the dust of their feet against them and returned to Iconium, 13:51. There also the Jews rose against them and threatened to stone them, so they fled to Lystra and Derbe, 14:6. At Lystra, Paul healed a cripple with the result that in the speech of Lycaonia they declared that they were gods, calling Barnabas Jupiter, thus according to the translator, but the actual word would probably have been Bel or Dis, and Paul, Mercurius, Hermes or Tot, 14:11-12. With difficulty they restrained these Gauls from worshipping them. The sequel, however, was that the Jews from Antioch and Iconium pursued them thither and stoned them so that Paul was thought to be dead, but he rose up again and next day departed for Derbe with Barnabas. It may be observed that Derbe, like Leicester, is one of the oldest inhabited cities of Britain, both being of considerable antiquity. The Romans had a station at Derbe, calling it Derventio, but it proudly. 196 Avienus Ori Maritimi, 130-4. 197 Watmore, Insulae Britannicae. Possesses its original name. Here with dauntless courage the apostles preached the gospel, taught many and returned to Antioch, 14:21. Subsequently, Paul and Silas went through Syria and Cilicia, the Bristol area, and again sailed overseas to Phrygia, the other Galatia, and Mysia, the Meuse area of France and Belgium, whence they sailed once more to Macedonia, 15:41, 16, 6-10. In view of the regional analysis which this reconstruction requires, need we question the outstanding identity of these two famous cities of the past and present, who should radiate their identity like Lincoln and York? Moreover, there was an ancient highway in Lycaonia, called the Egvina, e.g. or Weg, a way, a road, which led to the important city named Davina. According to Watmore, the Via Davina ran from Colchester to Chester, Deva, and passed through Leicester. He also records Devnina Way, which came from the east and went to Daventry, called Devnina. Records of the two are confused, and may have been one and the same, passing also through Derby. 198. Thus we may be said to possess evidence of a road or roads which linked both Leicester and Derby with Chester, coming from Colchester and passing through Flavia Caesarensis, later Mercia. And upon consideration, are not these two cities where we have a right to expect to find them, on the evidence that Lincoln was Antioch in Syria, but later embraced in Mercia, quite a different political region? Truly we remain commonly in profound ignorance of how England was populated in the early days of Christianity, but the type of peasant, working on the land, raising herds of cattle and flocks of sheep, and good archers, fits into the scheme. The Galatians, to whom Paul addressed his epistle, occupied the region which, according to my researches, was once that occupied by the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, who formed the kingdom of Israel apart from Judea after Solomon's time. The name Mercia may be ascribed as relating to Moses, and also was called Mesha. 198 Watt more, Insulae Britannicae. To return to York, so vital a clue to the past, it has been contended throughout this inquiry that Yorkshire was part of the original Syria even though the region was called Babylonia, and that Syria's origin was Chaldean. Its priests in the time of Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus were Chaldean magi, who detested the Jews, and herein perhaps lies the most potent confirmation of York's prehistoric past, because that city was ruled ecclesiastically by the Chaldese, or Choli Dei or Chaldeans, up to so late a period as 1154 of our present era. York had in fact been the metropolitan primatial religious city, not only of the north of England beyond the Humber and Mersey, but of all Scotland, including the Isles, embracing thus the sacred Druidical islands of Iona and Orkney. 199 How came that about? Canon Reign, of York, avers that the earliest known record of the famous minster was that in the 8th century it was in the possession of secular clergy, many married, who were called canons. The earlier archbishops resided there, and were accordingly Chaldese also. 200 In the 10th century King Athelstan founded the minster ruled by such Chaldese, and it would seem that Archbishop Egbert, circa 734, was himself a Chaldee or Chaldean prelate. It is a most interesting and important aspect of early ecclesiastical history, for, as Canon Reign stresses, this supremacy was very real, because they, archbishops, bishops, or canons, performed acts of visitation and consecration over and over again in Scotland. 201. Until 1072 Worcester was under the archbishopric and Lincoln at about the same time was taken from it, but until 1154 York remained supreme in the north. In that year Scotland withdrew from York, and the diocese surrendered the Isle of Man and Orkney to the archbishopric of Drontheim. 202 Previously also under York. In the 14th century it lost its last Scottish foothold in Galloway but recovered. Scotland withdrew for reasons more political than religious, for she did not seek communion with Rome until 1188. 199 Reign York, p. 163. 200 Reign, York pp 165-6. 201 Ibid, p. 163. 202 Ed Note, Drontheim was the capital of Norway from the 10th to the 13th century. Another aspect of this Chaldee jurisdiction is that as early as 625 Paulinus was sent by the Pope from Canterbury to found the church in York, but after converting certain persons in Lincoln he fled York for his life as the inhabitants rose against him, and became instead Bishop of Rochester. The Yorkists were Christians, but they would not recognize or support Rome, and Paulinus' mission to York, when we examine the evidence, appears to have been to induce the citizens to accept Rome as their spiritual head, against which they rose in fury and resentment. The Pope had actually deputed Paulinus to convert the Britons from the Firth of Forth to Lincoln, those very regions where, centuries earlier, St. Peter, St. Paul, St. Barnabas, St. John and others had labored so long and fiercely to convert both Gentiles and Jews to Christianity, and we have the authority of William of Glastonbury that Paulinus had to flee to Canterbury. Whether the Chaldee form of Christianity spread as far south as Canterbury I cannot pretend to say, but when Pope Gregory the Great sent Augustine there in 600, he had trouble with the men of Kent, who declared that they preferred their own traditions before all the churches in the world. 203 Gregory displayed so great a keenness to convert York to the Church of Rome that he decreed, when it accepted Christianity, evidently the Chaldee Church was not recognized, that it should become an archiepiscopal see equal to Canterbury. We may legitimately suspect that it was not unconcerned with St. Peter's mission there. Pope Gregory must have known that York had become Christian long before 600 AD because when Constantine the Great, who knew York well, it was where his father Constantius died, summoned bishops to the Council of Alls in 314, he named 3 British prelates, namely Eberacus of York, Restitutus of London, and Adolphius of Caerleon. Constantine, in the 8th year of his reign, would certainly have been acquainted with the position of Christianity in York and also in the region of the Forth. St. Helena's Church in York was dedicated to his mother. 203 A. E. Webb, Glastonbury. Legend, Tradition, History, p. 39. Clearly, then, Christianity was no new faith in York in 600, and in fact it was widespread in Britain by then. It was no light matter whereby the prelates of York exercised ecclesiastical superiority over all Scotland including Orkney and Iona, its sacred Druidic sites also including Norway. There must have been the strongest historical reasons in substantiation of this position from an early period. We know that Rome later borrowed many of her methods from the ancient Druid faith, and indeed, that Rome adopted the Christian faith from Britain, not the other way round. In the same way she copied the Cool-D trappings, the Flamens, with their red cardinal hat, the kissing of the toe of the Pope, excommunication, and other characteristics of the Celtic Church. 204 It all looks very much as though Rome seized upon all this as far as practicable, covered up this ecclesiastical larceny by changing and altering all the sacred sites, transferred them to a region far distant and more convenient, and thus obliterated the true origin and site of Christianity. One thing, however, Rome failed in her efforts to accomplish, much as she tried, and that was to remove the evidence of St. Peter's relationship with York, with the keys of St. Peter, and, it may be claimed, with his church built upon a rock, Pi Epsilon Tau Rho Omicron Sigma. Whether St. Peter went to Rome in the latter part of Nero's reign, 67–8, seems most doubtful. St. Paul, who was 2 years imprisoned and finally martyred there, does not allude to him in his epistle, but it has been claimed that the chief apostle not only went to Rome but was martyred there. Pope Pius XII, on March 2, 1950, opened the grottos beneath St. Peter's Basilica, and announced to the world the rediscovery of the tomb of the saint, first made public in 1943. It is claimed that the tomb is believed to be the sarcophagus in which his body was placed after its removal from the catacombs in the Via Appia Antica. It is an historical fact that Constantine, who should have known the circumstances, built a church consecrated to St. Peter over his burial place in Rome, unless of course it were another of his pious deceits. 204 Ezekiel 23, 14–15. She saw men portrayed upon the wall, the images of the Chaldeans portrayed with vermilion, girded with girdles upon their loins, exceeding in dyed attire upon their heads, all of them princes to look to. Canon Rain, with reference to the Cool-Ds of York, uses the words, secular clergy who may be traced elsewhere, especially across the Tweed. 205 This is misleading, for monastic Cool-Ds flourished in Scotland from very early times. In York there were Cool-D monastic orders long before Rome gained possession, including the white-robed Carmelites, a strict order who claimed their origin from Mount Carmel in Syria, and were related to the Essenes, a Jewish order, very pure and strict, of which Jesus himself, in the opinion of some, was a member. The Carmelite Church, St. Crux, Holy Cross, Monk Ward, so called after this celibate, preaching order, was the seat of their monastery, whose entrance is still quaintly named Wibmahop Magat, Wibmi Gate, its name descriptive of the voluntary flagellations performed by the early Carmelites. St. Crux at Wibma Gate today. For which name many less convincing derivations abound, ed. Canon Rain does not attempt to offer an explanation of how and why from an early time, long prior to the Roman domination, York should have become the primordial see over so great a part of Britain, including all Scotland and especially Orkney, long ruled by the Norse. To those who have studied these matters it is at once comprehensible. York, as Babylon, followed Ur, or Samothrace, as 205 Reign, York, p. 166. The headquarters of the Cool-D faith, because the Chaldeans ruled in these parts, as has been shown. The type of Christianity taught in Iona by Saint Columba, who, like Saint Patrick and other early church leaders, was originally at Glastonbury, had no communion with Rome, and followed the Cool-D or Gnostic system. The Cool-Ds or Chaldees deserve some mention as they were the teachers of mankind, even if they were dominating and severe, in a younger world. Diodorus tells us that their magi controlled the worship of the gods and taught philosophy and astrology among other things. They interpreted dreams, as Daniel did, and foretold the destinies of men from observation of the planets. 206 Strabo says there were several classes of Chaldean priests, particularly the Orcini and the Borsipines, who formed a caste with fixed traditional lore. The Orcini were obviously the Orphics of Orkney, Ur or Samothrace, and the Borsipines, inseparable from Babylon, point to the suburb of York, Borsippa, where later the episcopacy made their headquarters. These Chaldeans were the Gnostics, teachers of sacred science from the earliest times. That they were Druids is evident. C.W. King, an authority on these ancient orders, says that the Orphics of Samothrace, the Essenes of Ephesus, and the Curetes of Crete, formed one unique and common religion as taught by the Chaldeans. 207 The Essenes, who were closely related to the Nazarites, accepted the Jewish doctrine, placed Moses after God, and taught that Jesus was the crucified Christ. This approximated to St. Peter's teaching. Their sacred books were in the Chaldean tongue. 208 The Gnostics and Orphics, says King, regarded Christ as an aeon, and the crucifixion as a mythical event. They regarded the Jewish beliefs, acquired during the captivity in Babylon, as never instituted by the wisdom of the Almighty. They disputed the authority of 206 Diodorus, History 2. 29-31. 207 C.W. King, The Gnostics and Their Remains, p. 1. 208 Godfrey Higgins, Anacalypsis I, p. 747. Moses, and questioned that of the prophets. They considered that the conquest of Canaan could not be reconciled with the common notions of humanity and justice, and looked upon the laws of Moses as a mixture of bloody and trifling ceremonies. Moreover, they held that the Jewish Jehovah, or JHVH, was between a god and a demon, of capricious temperament, implacable and meanly jealous of his superstitious worship and prerogatives. Some even compared him with the principle of evil, and the Gnostic Basilides said he was an angel only, a word in distant times signifying fiery emanations, hence consuming fire. The Gnostics originally thought of Jesus as a Jewish prophet, but the Lord's Prayer is attributed to them. St. Paul managed to bridge the two diversities of thought between Gnostics and Messianists by teaching a cosmic Christ without repudiating Moses and his laws. The Essenes taught the coming of a Messiah of Jewish royal origin, and with him the approaching end of the world. Such were, generally speaking, the Chaldee sects, and they fairly represent the varying tendencies at the time when Constantine was contending with various clerical difficulties. They adopted Christianity as shown by the work of Saint Joseph of Arimathea at Avalon or Glastonbury from the earliest days after Jesus' death, and meanwhile Peter, Paul, and the other apostles were busy converting the Gentiles in the North and Midlands, and also the Jews, where permitted. Conversion was gradual but well spread, as shown in many directions, although Rome considered such heretical. Ralston says that Ireland was covered with monasteries teaching the Celtic faith, which eventually transferred en masse to the Roman dogma. 209 In the latter 4th century Theodosius, at the instance of Ambrosius of Milan, decreed an entire change of cultus throughout the Roman dominions, and heretics were tortured, burnt to death at the stake, or crucified. It would explain the hasty conversion of such Celts as the Roman emperor could reach. 209 Ralston, Myths and Legends of the Celtic Race, p. 83. However, sufficient has been said to prove the main object of this investigation, as far as we have gone. Whatever the virtues or faults of the Celtic or Chaldee faith, we can see why it was predominant at York, Chaldean territory as seen in a variety of ways including place names. In its day Chaldea and Syria were one and the same, and England as such did not yet exist. When the political and hence the ecclesiastical situation altered, when England and Scotland were segregated, as separate states on each side of the Tweed, the Scots no longer permitted the English city to dominate their religious needs, as was quite reasonable and natural. But from the point of view of this work we may see clearly why the Chaldees were in York and why York was Babylon as well as the other names attaching to it, Erech, Jericho, Stratos Tower, Caesarea, and Eboracum, for behind all these had flourished great Babylon, at one time mistress of the world, which accords naturally with its position, just as in the same way Edinburgh accords with Jerusalem. Lincoln is exemplified in Antioch, and likewise other sites in their rightful positions. Indeed, with care, the situations of the various kingdoms and states in the British Isles can be fitted into their true places with a good deal of certainty. From the foregoing, we can at least begin to understand why Queen Medb Khan not in Ireland, when she sent the 2 daughters of the wizard Caladan to learn magic and witchcraft in Alba and Babylon, she was not proposing to place them at the other end of the world, but actually to selected sites in the adjoining island. Chapter 9. The Silurian Wars with Rome. They saw their beloved isle invaded, torn, and despoiled by men whose desire was to loot it of its treasure of gold and pearls. Lewis Spence. In the long wars with Rome, the predominant